Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
War and warfare in the 20th century. What can we learn from war and warfare in the 20th century? What observations and deductions can we make? And what lessons can we draw? This new study examines both a clearly delineated period in the past and a century, which offers us the most relevant material to examine. I'd like to say that Jim Storr, author of War and Warfare in the 20th Century, joins me live on the line now. Jim, good morning to you.
Well, good morning to you, Giles.
Good to have you with us. Whereabouts are you this morning, by the way?
In a lovely village not very far from Birmingham. Or put it another way, Worcestershire.
Worcestershire. That's a very nice way of putting it. English Civil War and all that. Right, then let's thinking about sort of reflections on the past and modern warfare. But, I mean, do you think that the 20th century, we saw a fundamental change in both strategic, operational, and tactical objectives of warfare that pretty much had remained unchanged since sort of the Greek infantry, back in the ancients?
No, not really. It was about that period, about 450 years before Christ, that Herodotus wrote that people wage war because of fear, honour, and interest. I changed that very slightly. I think that people start wars fundamentally because they see some advantage in doing that. Now, that might be a statement of the blindingly obvious, but anyway, if that's true about why they wage war at the strategic level, then that comes down to the campaign or operational level, and that comes down to the tactical or battle level. So the reasons why we fight battles are to do with winning campaigns. The reasons why we fight campaigns are to do with winning wars, and I don't think that's really changed at that level since then.
Can you argue that the nature of warfare then perhaps in the 20th century became more fluid? Because when we think about campaigns, they tend to, in Europe especially, there was campaigning season, i.e. when the weather was good, and everything sort of stopped then during the winter months. And if you think about sort of battles in the ancient medieval period were particularly dangerous things, because if you lost a battle, that was pretty much, your army was pretty much marked. And so therefore siege warfare was perhaps the sort of the modus operandi rather than pitched battles.
Well, there's a couple of questions there. The first one is about more fluid. There have always been winter campaigns. Julius Caesar records a winter campaign, but they were dangerous, and there was all sorts of risks that didn't really occur if you campaigned in the middle of the year, the summer and the autumn. That's the first point. The second thing about sieges. Sieges are a particular balance about the strength of the defence and the mobility and the strength of field armies. If you look, for example, at Napoleon's warfare, he virtually never conducted a siege, whereas the century before that, there had been 100 of them. So siege warfare sort of comes and goes.
So with the 20th century, are we looking at the industrialization of warfare? Can you argue that maybe the 20th century warfare begins, say early 1870s with the Franco-Prussian War, where a much more mobile force and a much more mechanized force in terms of machine guns, etc., or machine-type guns with the Prussians, it inflicts damage on the French, and this is the way that the Prussian/Germans will do their warfare for the next sort of 80 years?
Well, there's a couple of things there. The first one about industrialization. You can sensibly say that the Royal Navy of the late 18th century was industrializing, and that accelerates through the 19th, and very much we see it in the 20th century. But then the second thing is you talk about particular weapons and weapon systems like machine guns. That's all about technological development, and that's a seesaw. If there's a technological development, the people on the other side want to counter that. They come up with either a technical or a tactical counter, and the pendulum moves on. So what, to my mind, you see is more about a continuity in warfare with occasional big rapid changes, but they're not necessarily as big as you might think.
Well, you mentioned naval, and one of the reasons is Britain obviously becomes the supreme naval power, and therefore can enforce its politics or its policies throughout the world, because nobody can kind of match the British Army, British Navy, excuse me. But also, of course, during the 20th century, we see the rise of air power, and obviously during the Second World War, I mean, air power, air superiority or air supremacy is extremely important.
Yeah, again, you've got to be careful not to take that too far. There are people who say, in fact, there's a lady down in this lovely little village where I live who told me that the Royal Air Force and the Americans bombed Germany, and that means that they won the war. I would contest that very strongly. There are a lot of historians who would. Yeah, without doubt, aerial warfare changes the current nature of war, and that hasn't basically gone away, and it's not going to, whilst we can still continue to fly machines. But will that be exactly the same 100 years from now? Yes, there will still be machines in the air. Yeah, but I think it'll be quite different.
I mean, do you think we are seeing perhaps with what's been happening in the situation maybe in Gaza or the situation with Ukraine, where we're seeing drones, for example, manned drone strikes coming on both sides in terms of the Ukraine campaign, and we're seeing sort of drone warfare is now being seen as perhaps the trend or a harbinger of how war's going to develop.
Yeah, but again, that's true. So what you see, particularly in Ukraine, is a sudden position where drones are very, very important. They have a massive impact. But what you're already seeing at defense shows and this, that, the other, and particularly in the defense literature, is massive investment in systems that counter drones. So that's what I say about a new technology, a counter, and in the process, warfare moves on.
So with war and warfare in the 20th century, what is the, if you like, the starting point? Is it to re-examine? I mean, you've already sort of said some of the things that I put to you there about air superiority, etc. I mean, do we need to, now that we have a standpoint of quarter of a century since the end of the 20th century, is it time to have a long clinical look about what we learnt? Because obviously we have the First World War, and that's the Great War and trench warfare, and then we have that. Obviously, that has a huge traumatic effect on how generals are going to, or how people want to fight the Second World War, because they believe it's going to be another horrendous trench situation. So is it a case of and then during the 50s, we entered the atomic age, and then therefore we don't have, thankfully, the nuclear war that people thought we were going to come close to, but we have a whole load, if you like, localized conflict, and I mean that in the most in its roughest sense, because you can hardly call the sort of the Vietnam War a localized conflict, or the struggles in the Middle East localized. But is this the reason you're writing this book, to have a sort of, if you like, clinical look at the way that warfare was fought in the 20th century?
Yeah, very much so. Looking forward slightly, the next book, which I'm about to start very soon, will be about a theory of warfare. And in order to do that, I really wanted to baseline what we know about war and warfare, and hence the book.
So, I mean, what lessons are you hoping that we're going to draw from this then? I mean, because, when politicians get involved in military planning, it tends to get a little bit go a little bit awry. I mean, not only just Hitler taking over from the Wehrmacht of after the assassination attempts in 1944, but also when we're looking at politicians saying, oh, well, we need to have a nuclear deterrent. And then obviously it's not used because it's a deterrent, or we need to be investing in cyber war, and then suddenly we don't have enough. For example, the British Army is being stretched, you could argue, from pillar to post, trying to deal with localized conflicts, and then we might think it's all going to be cyber war with people driving into their bunkers, from their houses, waging war remotely, and then going home, and then you get a throwback, if you like, to a European conflict with the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, there's all sort of issues there, but fundamentally, I think we have to recognize that politicians aren't particularly good at waging war. I'm not saying that the generals and the admirals are necessarily better, but there's all sorts of instances where politicians have made bad strategic choices, either in the run-up to war or during wars.
So,
and ironic. Sorry, you were saying.
After you, sorry, you just said ironically. So please go on.
Yeah. Perhaps the one exception, and he's certainly not the only exception, but Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is a brilliant war leader. He's not perfect. He has human failures. He is a human being. But we have to remember that he was a minister in the First World War.
Yeah,
in fact, he ran the Navy.
Yeah,
he ran the Navy at the beginning of the war.
He's First Lord of the Admiralty, isn't he? So he's got that, and he's also fought in the Boer campaign. So he's got that, the boots on the ground experience.
Yeah, exactly. And so Britain is incredibly lucky in 1940 when he comes along, because we have an incredibly experienced and also very capable Prime Minister. People like that are very rare. That's one of the sort of things that I like to draw out in the book.
And so where do we go from here then? Do you think it's going to be a case of, a modern fighting force, be it naval, air force, or indeed, but be it land-based, they have to be more nimble, but not forgetting that, at the end of the day, warfare really hasn't changed much since we, as you said at the beginning of the interview, and it's still going to be a case of the poor bloody infantry at some point or other.
You asked me to make a prediction, and I think it was Niels Bohr, one of the atomic physicists, who said that prediction is always difficult, particularly when it's about the future. Again, that's a thing that I look at in the book. But to go back to your story, your question, I think the big issue is that revolution and war are quite rare. Mm-hmm. And when you look at them from a distance, you can usually see them coming. So I think that the next major war that, should we say, Western powers get involved in will look particularly like, or very much like, the wars that we have fought in the past, but with a bit of a twist.
What are you hoping that people will take then from war and warfare in the 20th century? What are you hoping they will discover?
The great thing that I came to when I started reading the book, that the problem with lessons or takeaways is it depends what you already know. So I didn't pretend to say this is a lesson, that's a lesson, that's a lesson. I did say here are observations and deductions that we can make. I wouldn't like to be more arrogant than that.
The book is called War and... Okay, well, just a final thing then. Do you think we are living in more secure times, more dangerous times, or has it always been the same, and it's just the fact that we have social media and 24-hour news and whatever now that makes us feel that the world is a much more dangerous place?
I think the latter is certainly true. We feel that war is a more dangerous place. Whether it's actually true or not, or whether that in itself creates a risk that people believe that, and therefore they rush to war to protect themselves, that's perhaps a risk.
The book is called War and Warfare in the 20th Century. It's by Jim Storr, who we're speaking to today. Jim, if people want to find you online, is there a website? Do you do the aforementioned social media? Where can people find you?
I don't tend to do very much of that. If you Google me, you'll certainly find me. If you looked on LinkedIn, you'll find me there, but also on Facebook.
The book is called War and Warfare in the 20th Century. You can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Jim, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Giles. Thank you very much.